William, the Prince of Wales and heir to the throne, is watching all of this with a clarity born not of detachment but of urgency, because for William the stakes extend beyond the present crisis into the future that his own children will inherit, the institution that George and Charlotte and Louis will one day be asked to serve, and the conditions under which they will be required to carry that responsibility. When William observes his uncle's legal strategy, the scorched earth posture, the willingness to threaten judicial action against the government his own brother leads, he sees not merely a family dispute or a personal scandal, but rather a fundamental threat to the viability of the monarchy itself, a demonstration that the reputational capital accumulated across generations through discipline and service and personal sacrifice can be depleted by the defensive maneuvers of a single individual who has concluded that his own preservation matters more than anything else. The historical comparison being invoked by those attempting to situate this crisis within the longer arc of royal history is the Duke of Windsor, Edward VIII, who abdicated in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson and spent the remainder of his life in a kind of gilded exile, a cautionary tale about what happens when personal desire is placed above institutional duty, when a royal makes himself incompatible with the requirements of the crown, and the institution must accept permanent separation from someone who can no longer be accommodated within its structures. The parallels are imperfect in significant ways. The circumstances differ, the nature of the crises differ, the legal frameworks differ, but the underlying pattern is unmistakable: a royal who cannot be contained within the institution, a family forced to accept distance from a member whose continued proximity represents an unacceptable risk, an exile that is imposed rather than chosen, and the particular hollowness of a life lived in diminished grandeur, with the telephone no longer ringing, and the invitations no longer arriving, and the awareness that the world has moved on without you. Andrew's version of that existence is already underway at Marsh Farm in Norfolk, surrounded by security fencing and the agricultural odors of a working farm, and the specific silence that descends when status has been stripped away. But the danger in his situation extends beyond social ostracism into the realm of criminal liability, because a trial in which a former senior royal is prosecuted for using his government position to facilitate connections with a convicted sex offender would create a moment in the history of the British monarchy that would require generations to process and absorb. The threat of judicial review is designed to create exactly that kind of stalemate, to produce a legal standoff that neither side can resolve quickly, and that therefore preserves the current ambiguity for as long as the legal mechanisms can be made to sustain it. And Andrew is calculating that the institution will ultimately decide that the reputational damage of a very public trial outweighs the reputational cost of a negotiated settlement that allows the investigation to conclude without the full contents of the documents entering the public domain. It is a gamble that rests on an assessment of whether the monarchy's stated commitment to the principle that nobody is above the law will survive contact with the practical reality of prosecuting one of its own former members, whether the institution, when faced with that choice, will prioritize its stated values or its institutional comfort. Charles is suspended between these incompatible imperatives, between the brother who is his blood and the institution whose integrity is his sacred responsibility, between the mercy that his nature and his religious convictions and his understanding of human frailty would incline him toward, and the requirements of a role that demands something harder and less forgiving, and he is being forced to preside over the severance of a bond that under any other circumstances he would fight to preserve, because the alternative is allowing the damage to continue accumulating until the institution itself becomes unsustainable. The Succession and Accountability Act that has reportedly moved from private discussions to serious parliamentary consideration represents the institutional response to the question that Andrew's situation has made impossible to defer any longer, which is what happens when royal titles and royal status are no longer sanctuaries where ordinary law pauses at the gates, but rather positions that carry expectations and responsibilities and consequences for failure to meet them. The era in which a royal could shelter indefinitely behind the prestige of bloodline regardless of conduct or contribution is being brought to a close by precisely the kind of case that makes its closure most necessary, and Andrew's continued use of the status he no longer formally occupies, his deployment of legal resources and public attention that his royal history continues to generate, all in service of avoiding the accountability that the institution is simultaneously trying to demonstrate it supports, creates a contradiction that cannot be sustained indefinitely. William is watching all of this and drawing conclusions that will shape the monarchy he leads when his father's reign eventually ends, watching a man who received everything from the institution use every tool at his disposal to avoid answering for how he used what he was given, watching the legal and constitutional machinery of the state being threatened by someone whose capacity to make that threat depends entirely on the connection to the state he is simultaneously trying to evade, watching the cost of delayed action and managed ambiguity and the choice to absorb rather than confront play out in ways that are both publicly visible and institutionally corrosive, and he is taking notes. The purification that William envisions for the future monarchy, the lean and accountable and purpose-driven institution he has been describing through both public statements and private interventions, is being made both more urgent and more clearly necessary by everything Andrew's crisis is revealing about the vulnerabilities of the current system, and the removal of the York branch from the official narrative of the royal family, the surgical excision of Andrew, and by extension the diminishment of Beatrice and Eugenie's roles, despite their personal conduct having warranted no such consequence, reflects an institutional logic that prioritizes survival over sentiment. For Charles, there is genuine grief in this, not the performative sorrow of public statements, but the private anguish of a man who values family bonds and continuity, and the possibility of reconciliation being forced to oversee the permanent dissolution of a relationship he would have preserved if any other option had been available to him, forced to choose the institution over the individual, the crown over the brother, the future over the past. The price of monarchy has always included sacrifice. That formulation appears in every serious analysis of what constitutional kingship requires, but the specific sacrifice being demanded of Charles at this moment, to dismantle a personal bond in order to preserve an institution, to watch his brother weaponize the state against the state, to manage a crisis that has no clean resolution and will not end quietly regardless of what decisions are made, represents one of the heaviest burdens any modern British monarch has been asked to bear. Andrew is no longer the Duke of York, residing in the fortress of royal protection, but rather a man standing in a farmhouse in Norfolk surrounded by security cameras and legal strategies and the accumulated consequences of decades of choices, watching the institution that provided him with everything he ever had continue its operations without him, and the law in whatever form it ultimately takes, and at whatever pace the specific procedures determine is coming. The question of how it arrives and what it discovers when it does, and what the country and the monarchy are required to absorb in the aftermath, remains the unresolved center of a narrative that has been unfolding for years, and shows no indication of reaching the quiet conclusion that everyone except Andrew appears to recognize as inevitable. Charles is in London managing an institution under siege from within, William is observing and preparing for the monarchy he will inherit, and the fog that settled over the palace, persistent and freezing and without visible edges, the fog that makes every surface cold and every movement effortful, has not lifted and will not lift until the full accounting is complete.